All right, our next speaker is Eli Harman. He needs no further introduction. He's here to talk about propertarianism. Thanks for coming, Eli. All right, hi there, thank you. I'm going to talk about propertarianism, and propertarianism is a school of thought associated with Kurt Doolittle, who some of you may know online. And a lot of people have some confusion about propertarianism, about what it is or what Kurt's talking about some of the times. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that and hopefully clarify a little bit what is propertarianism and how does it relate. And I am going to make some references to and comparisons with libertarianism. I assume most of you are familiar with libertarianism. Some of you maybe are not, so if not, I apologize. And I know that libertarianism isn't terribly relevant, so I apologize for that too, but propertarianism kind of grows out of libertarianism historically. So that's where it comes from. Kurt's a former libertarian. I'm a former libertarian. A lot of propertarians are former libertarians. Pretty much true for the alt-right as well. So, so that's something you kind of have to talk about a little bit in relation to propertarianism. Now, the basic point about propertarianism, the reason why it's called propertarianism, is because there's a huge range of cultural and social and political phenomena that you can think of or conceive of or model as property transactions or property rights or people's reactions to changes in inventories of property. And that's why it's called propertarianism, because you're thinking about issues in terms of those things, in terms of property. So what is property? Well, libertarians have a very specific theory of property, which is their homesteading theory of original appropriation. You go out into the wild, stuff's unowned, and you mix your labor with the land or whatever, and in that way it becomes yours. And so for libertarians, property is kind of, in that way, a natural outgrowth of self-ownership, because the labor's yours. Once you mix the labor with the unowned resources, then they become yours. That's a moral theory, which propertarianism is about empiricism, about looking at how things are and trying to figure out why they are how they are. Whereas libertarianism is a prescriptive, moral kind of framework. And the difference with propertarianism is, we just say that property is what people value enough that they're willing to fight for. Property is what people are willing and able to defend as their own. And it can take many forms. The basic form of territoriality in animals is, you'll have an animal go out and mark its territory by urinating on it or on its boundaries or whatever. But there's some way of marking the territory. And what that does, that's a promise that if another member of its species enters that territory, there's going to be a fight. And so if the violation occurs, then there's the conflict, and either the original claim is sustained or it's overturned. And that's what property is. The difference with humans is our territorial behavior can be a lot more complex and a lot more varied. It's not limited just to pissing on land. But I mean, libertarians basically kind of constrain it back down to that, because under libertarian theory, they have, Kurt calls it intersubjectively verifiable property, which is basically like, it's limited to private physical property. That's what's legitimate property. A lot of libertarians are really down on like intellectual property or common property or any kind of intangible property or really anything other than personal, private, physical property. They're not into that. Or like property value. A libertarian might probably would consider it to be illegitimate to attempt to protect the value of your property by policing what your neighbors do, because that is going to infringe on your neighbor's, let's say, liberty to do what they want with their property. If you tell them, no, you can't slaughter hogs right next door to me, that's an infringement of their property rights according to a libertarian. And the hog slaughtering or whatever other noisy, smelly thing that they're doing to decrease the value of your property is a lower priority for libertarians than the physical integrity. So, so in contrast, propertarianism, anything can be property if people value it enough that they're willing to defend it. So if you value the value of your property, and you're able to get together with your neighbors and define terms for how people can use their property to preserve the values of each, then that's a form of property that you could protect. The value of your property could itself be a form of property. And you could protect that by policing your neighbors to make sure that they don't impose costs on you or others. And if they're imposing costs, if you're doing some kind of behavior that's imposing costs, whether it's a noise or an odor or an unsightly whatever, then not only are you going to reckon that as a cost, and it's going to decrease the value of your property to you, but other people are going to reckon it as a cost too. And so when you go to sell your property, you're not going to be able to get as good a price for it because there are going to be less people interested in your property, or they're going to factor that cost into what they're willing to offer for the property. So that can be an intangible form of property that's valid, is the value of your property. You can also have common property. Now, libertarians are really down on common property because they talk about things like the tragedy of the commons, and this is an economic issue or effect that's been investigated a lot, and that's when you have a common property and people are free to access it and use it, then it tends to get overused or misused. Because it's not, somebody will get all of the benefit from overusing it or misusing it, but the cost is shared, so they're not bearing the full cost. And so libertarians have remarked that there's kind of a natural and persistent intrinsic tendency for people to overuse or misuse common pool resources. And so they're really down on commons, and they just want everything to be private. And the problem with that is, as happens so many times with libertarianism, yeah, you can find examples of the tragedy of the commons, but you can also find examples of commons that are well maintained and well managed and well run, and where that doesn't happen. And this was a line of research that was done by Eleanor Ostrom. She won a Nobel Prize for this. She did all this investigation of commons. And she found out that there were basically 8 rules for a common pool resource and managing a common pool resource in a sustainable way. And the rules were, so they have to be clearly defined. What is the property? Who has access to the property? Who can use it? How can they use it? That all has to be defined. So that's the first condition. The form of that property has to be adapted to local conditions and local people and whatever else, whatever other local factors. There has to be like a collective participation where most people who have access to the common property, and by the way, not everybody has access. That's the other thing. You have to exclude people, whether they're out-group members or whatever. Certain people are excluded. It's not universal access. But the people who are part of the commons, there has to be some way for them to participate in decision making. There has to be monitoring of usage and misusage, and a graduated series of sanctions or punishments for misuse or overuse of the resource. There has to be a mechanism of conflict resolution, and also some local self-determination, so the community will have their commons that they maintain, and that has to be respected by higher levels of government or whatever. And finally, if it's a really large common pool resource, there are nested layers of community and hierarchy and whatever else accessing and using it. So you have different institutions at different scales. And if you have all that, you can have a common property that's well maintained and well run. And the difference between a common property and, let's say, like shareholder property is everybody who is a stakeholder in a commons has approximately equal access and equal rights to that commons, versus shareholder property, which can be unequally divided. But so all this research she did on commons led to something called Ostrom's Law, which is any property arrangement that can work in practice can be made to work in theory. And so that's kind of a dig at well, I don't know if it's explicitly a dig at libertarians, but it can be because they get really tied up in their theories and really invested in their theories, and they tend to be built, step by step from a series of what libertarians consider to be irrefutable axioms, and then so the theory becomes irrefutable because it's a straightforward logical deduction from the irrefutable axioms. And so if you look at something in reality and it conflicts with the theory, then the libertarian would conclude that reality is wrong. Or that's not how they're going to say it, but that's how it's going to end up. More or less what they're going to end up saying. And so in contrast to that approach where you're building intellectual castles in the sky, Propertarianism is an empirical approach, a scientific approach. And what does that mean? So critical rationalism is the epistemology of science, the philosophy of how science works and how scientific knowledge is acquired. And so critical rationalism basically states that truth is objective, it's out there, it's not purely subjective or whatever. We can't know the truth for certain because that depends on all of the facts. You have a set of facts, measurements say, and you want to explain those facts. You want to explain how they relate to each other. You want to explain how they relate to reality, so you come up with theories to explain the facts. Well, your theory could agree with the facts or it could disagree with the facts. If it disagrees with the facts, the theory is wrong. If it agrees with the facts, it's not wrong yet, right? You don't know. There could be some facts that you discover later on that disagree with the theory, and that means the theory is wrong. There may be another theory that also agrees with the facts. Now, which theory is right? Because they may be contradictory. And if they're contradictory, at least one of them has to be wrong. So, the goal is to find more facts and start weeding out theories. And hopefully that way, over time, your theories improve. The concise way of putting this is, we can't know the truth of a theory for certain because that depends on all of the facts. And we don't necessarily know. In fact, we almost never know all of the facts. And we definitely don't know that we know all of the facts. So, there's some facts that are unknown, and we don't know how many facts are unknown. So we can't say that the theory is true based on the facts. We can say that it agrees with the facts as we understand them, and therefore it might be true. And if it doesn't agree with the facts, it's untrue. So that's an empirical approach to, it's kind of a process of elimination approach to improving theories over time. You just throw them out there, or maybe they're educated guesses, so you're looking at the facts and you're trying to come up with a coherent theory to explain them. But then you're weeding out the theories that don't work. And that's a scientific approach. A lot of scientists don't even understand this because you'll hear them say stuff like scientific consensus or settled science. That's not how science works. Science doesn't work on the basis of consensus, and it doesn't work on the basis of proof by supporting evidence. It works on falsification of disconfirming evidence, false theories being disconfirmed by disconfirming evidence. And hopefully what's left after that falsification is better than what you started out with. It's an evolutionary process that leads towards better and better theories. You never know that you have the correct theory or the best theory, but you can be pretty confident you're moving towards it. So that contrasts with what libertarians typically do, which is rationalism. Not critical rationalism, but just rationalism, where you start with some kind of axiom that you consider to be irrefutable, and you're logically building up a whole edifice of theory on the basis of those axioms. And the problem with that is you can build a castle in the sky, but it's not necessarily connected to reality. And then if there's some discrepancy with reality, then you have to try to explain that discrepancy away. And that's more often what they do rather than amending the theory. So it's a different approach to science, different approach to knowledge, a different approach to property. And how does that relate to nationalism? Well, a nation can be common property. And a lot of the ways in which the leftists try to attack nationalism in nations is to undermine people's sense of connection to that property or ownership over that property or personal responsibility for that property. For example, modern art, modern architecture. A lot of these things are designed explicitly to uglify common spaces. And if you uglify common spaces, people feel less of a connection to them. They feel less possessive of them. If you have, a beautiful Gothic cathedral or something like that, this is something that's awe-inspiring. It's awe-inspiring even today, but think about 800 years ago when people were living in huts with mud floors. And then every week at least they go to the cathedral. And it's just stained glass and huge vaulted ceilings and stone and everything. Amazing, awe-inspiring. That's something people can identify with. And furthermore, there's a community around it of people who all identify with it together, and they have rituals to cement that community and to cement that identity. Right? That's something that people will defend. That's something that people will preserve. That's something that people will perpetuate. It's their property. They'll defend it because they have feelings for it. But you take some modern architecture, square, cubic, brutalist, whatever. Nobody gives a crap about that. Nobody cares about that. And so if you can ugly it up with this modern architecture or modern art, every city you go into now has some jumbled pile of crap in the middle of some square somewhere, probably more than one. And again, ugly it up, something that people can't identify with, something that people can't rally around, something that people can't conceive of as communal property or common property because they don't have any identification with it. It doesn't do anything for them. They're not going to maintain it. They're not going to defend it. There's not going to be a community that grows around it. It's one way you can undermine a nation or attack a nation. In other ways with culture, with entertainment, with media. Why are they always trying to have a black James Bond? Or why are they trying to put diversity into our folklore and into our mythology and into our history in every movie that comes out? And they're trying to do it to break our connection with it. So it's not something that we identify with and we feel possessive of. And it doesn't constitute a set of shared signals around which we can form a community. So they're just trying to disrupt that relationship that makes it a form of common intangible property. Culture is a form of common intangible property. And the people who possess a culture in common, you could call them a culture, or maybe even a nation. And if you can sever that connection of the individual with that culture, then you can disrupt that nation or that culture or that group. And so that's one thing that they do quite deliberately. And that we could counter just as deliberately by being more aware of this relationship between culture and property, or culture as a form of property that we share in common. I think that's a pretty good introduction. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to say. I'll just in closing, I'll say that propertarianism per se is not a political philosophy or political program. It's an approach to thinking about issues and questions and debating them and discussing them. And so you could use propertarian arguments or propertarian kinds of questions to articulate and to defend a variety of different political positions. So propertarianism doesn't come out and say, well, monarchy is the best way, or fascism is the best way, or democracy is the best way. You could defend all of these things in a propertarian way or with propertarian rhetoric. under different circumstances, right? Because everything works within limits. Everything has bounds within which maybe it is the best under those circumstances. And just the trick is to think about things in an empirical way, so you're relating it to external reality, and also in a way that's free of error, bias, deception, fraud, because pseudoscience is rife with that. That's what pseudoscience is. It's a means of engaging in fraud, deception, bias, wishful thinking. Marxism, classic example. Feminism, psychoanalysis, another pseudoscience. And so propertarianism is a way of avoiding those errors and deceptions, making it harder to deceive. And so hopefully you can discuss things in a more honest and empirical way. And if people still don't agree about them, after that, then you have to maybe compromise or separate or whatever. But it's an approach to asking those questions and attempting to answer them. It's not a specific set of prescriptions or a policy program. So on that note, any questions?